Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she inspects a house filled with whispers and a door that made no sense. Each time it opened, it revealed the same room, as if the house itself refused to let her leave. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind that door isn't just strange, it's terrifying. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second, until the very end. Chapter 1. The door that led to the same room. It was a late September afternoon, in the village of Lower Bramble, the kind of day when the air smelled faintly of fallen apples and wood smoke, and the lanes were mottled with shadows from the turning leaves. Miss Jane Marple, knitting bag in hand, was on her way to the old Wetherby house for what had been advertised as a most charming little tea to mark the end of summer. The house had recently been taken over by Mr. and Mrs. Fenton, an outwardly amiable couple with polished manners and a habit of looking at each other for half a beat too long before speaking, as though silently agreeing on what could and could not be said aloud. The Wetherby house was a sprawling affair, its stone walls softened by ivy and its windows glinting in the low sun. But it had a reputation for oddities, whispered about over teacups in the village. Some said it had been built in fits and starts over generations, with staircases that ended in cupboards and doors that opened into unexpected corners. One particular door at the end of a dim upstairs corridor was the subject of a curious legend. It always led back to the same room, no matter which way you approached it. Miss Marple had heard such tales before, and while she did not place much stock in village lore, she knew well that houses, like people, could carry the residue of long-forgotten arrangements. The gathering itself was modest, a few tables set with china teacups, scones, and delicate sandwiches, the kind that threatened to fall apart if looked at too sternly. There was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pembroke, smiling in that brisk way that suggested she was mentally keeping track of everyone's sins. Colonel Hargrave, his stories of Burma having grown no shorter over the years, and young Lydia Marsh, a quiet girl of 19 with a talent for drawing and a gaze that seemed fixed on things others could not see. Mrs. Fenton moved between guests with a practiced ease, refilling cups, while Mr. Fenton lingered near the French doors, his watchful eyes following every movement in the room. It was just after the clock struck 4 that the first disturbance occurred. Not a murder, not yet, but the kind of small, unexpected moment that plants the seed for darker things. Lydia had been upstairs, she said, sketching the carved banister on the landing when she decided to explore. She'd opened a door at the end of the corridor and found herself in a small, neat bedroom with a lace-draped bed and a faint smell of lavender. She swore she had closed the door behind her and continued on her way. But, some minutes later, she opened another door at the opposite end of the hall and stepped into the exact same room. The others laughed it off, calling it a trick of the house's eccentric layout. But Miss Marple, from her place by the hearth, watched Lydia's pale, slightly puzzled face with quiet interest. She knew that young people, especially those inclined to dreaminess, could imagine odd connections where none existed. And yet, something in the girl's voice, that precise note of unease, made Miss Marple wonder. The rest of the afternoon passed without further incident until the guests were preparing to leave. There was a commotion upstairs, a sharp cry, and the hurried thud of footsteps. Mr. Fenton appeared at the top of the staircase, his expression stiff and unreadable, and announced that no one was to leave just yet. A man had been found in the upstairs bedroom, the very one Lydia had described, and he was quite unmistakably dead. Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands, her eyes calm and steady. Around her, voices rose in confusion, in protest, in whispered speculation. But she had already fixed her attention on one small, overlooked detail, Lydia's account of the door that led to the same room. It was, she suspected, not a mere oddity of architecture, but the first thread in a web someone had gone to great trouble to weave. Chapter 2. The village Reaxby. The following morning, the news had seeped into every corner of Lower Bramble, moving along the familiar channels of whispered conversation over garden gates, chance encounters at the greengrocer's, and carefully casual exchanges at the post office. A man, unknown to most in the village, had been found dead in the Fentons' upstairs bedroom during what was supposed to have been an entirely genteel tea gathering. No one knew his name, or at least no one admitted to knowing it. But this did little to stem the tide of speculation. Theories flourished in the warm autumn air like mushrooms after rain, each one embroidered with a detail slightly more dramatic than the last dot at the Red Fox Inn. Mr. Giles, the landlord, was convinced the fellow was a burglar who had come to the wrong house, though he could not explain why a burglar would be lying so neatly on the bed, with no sign of a struggle. Mrs. Pembroke, the vicar's wife, insisted to anyone who would listen that the man was a distant relative of Mrs. Fenton's, who had arrived unannounced and promptly collapsed from some dreadful heart complaint. Young Tom Fletcher, whose mother worked as a cleaner for the Fentons, whispered to his school friends that the man had been poisoned, an assertion based entirely on the fact that the doctor had been called in before the constable, which to Tom seemed irrefutably suspicious. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her errands with the same unhurried grace she always carried, though her eyes, alert behind her spectacles, missed very little. She heard the varying accounts without adding her own, nodding politely to the more elaborate stories and murmuring a non-committal "dear me" to the rest. She had long since learned that people, when encouraged with nothing more than a gentle nod, would often reveal far more than they intended. And indeed, by the time she had returned from the baker's with a fresh loaf, she had gleaned that the Fentons had not been in the village long less than a year, and that their past was a matter of some curiosity. Mrs. Fenton, it was said, had once been a governess to a family of means, though exactly whose family no one seemed to know. And Mr. Fenton had been involved in business abroad, which could mean anything from importing spices to smuggling arms, depending on the teller. The constable, a conscientious but rather literal-minded young man named Harold Briggs, was doing his best to keep the matter contained. He had stationed himself outside Wetherby House that morning, allowing no one in without permission, though half the village had found excuses to pass by the front gate, in hopes of catching a glimpse of anything that might lend color to their conversations. Inside, the coroner had already taken the body away, and Mrs. Fenton was said to be quite overcome, while Mr. Fenton remained tight-lipped, his expression giving nothing away. It was over tea that afternoon, in the cozy, lamplit parlor of her own home, that Miss Marple received her first direct account from someone who had been there after she had left the previous evening. Lydia Marsh had knocked on her door timidly, as though unsure she ought to be there, and now sat in the low armchair by the fire, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white. She was pale, her large eyes shadowed, and she spoke in fits and starts, as though afraid of saying something that could not be unsaid. "I didn't know him," she began. "The man upstairs, but I think I'm certain I've seen him before. In the village, months ago. He was talking to Mrs. Fenton by the churchyard. They stopped when they saw me, as though I'd interrupted something." She hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple with a kind of quiet desperation. "I can't tell the constable that, can I? It sounds so silly. He'd think I was making trouble." Miss Marple, her needles clicking steadily, offered no direct advice, merely a mild observation. "People often find themselves in the way of things they don't understand, my dear. The important thing is to remember exactly what one saw, and not to try to fill in the gaps with what one thinks must have been there. Lydia bit her lip, nodded, and fell silent. Outside, the village clock struck 4, and the soft drizzle that had been falling all day thickened into a steady rain. It blurred the hedgerows and set the cobblestones glistening, as though the whole village were holding its breath. Miss Marple thought again of the curious detail from the day before the 2 doors that had led to the same room and of the body found within. Houses could be like stage sets. She mused, the arrangement of their parts could be used to deceive, to hide, to suggest something entirely different from the truth. By evening, the speculation had reached a fever pitch. At the Red Fox, someone swore that the dead man's shoes had been muddy, suggesting he had come on foot from the woods. Others claimed the soles had been perfectly clean, proof that he had been in the house for some time before his death. Each version was offered with the certainty of first-hand knowledge, though none of the tellers had been within 100 yards of the room. Miss Marple, for her part, made no declaration, but she did allow herself a private conclusion. The man had not simply wandered into the Fentons' home. He had been there for a reason, one that someone in the village or very close to it had a great deal of interest in concealing, and in her experience, such concealments rarely came without a tangle of smaller, older secrets clinging to them like burrs. She banked the fire for the night, the warm glow falling across her knitting, and listened to the rain patter against the window panes. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the garden gate, she felt the threads of the story were already tightening, drawing the players closer together. It would not be long before another piece of the puzzle slipped into view, quite by accident unless, of course, someone took steps to ensure it never did. Chapter 3. The first suspects. 2 days after the tea at Wetherby House, the drizzle had given way to a pale, brittle sunlight, the kind that made the cobblestones gleam, but did little to warm the air. The village seemed quieter than usual, as though its people had collectively agreed to tread softly while the matter of the dead man remained unresolved. Constable Briggs had been seen in earnest conversation with several locals, his notebook clutched as if it were a lifeline. The general opinion was that the case would soon be concluded, for Briggs had already dropped hints none too subtly that he was making progress, and progress, in such situations, often meant finding someone who could be conveniently labeled the culprit. It was during her customary morning walk to the grocer's that Miss Marple overheard the first murmurs of who this might be. Outside the shop, Mrs. Pembroke was speaking in low tones to Mrs. Dalrymple, whose talent for embroidery was matched only by her appetite for other people's misfortunes. "It's that Marsh girl," Mrs. Pembroke declared with the solemn satisfaction of one who has at last uncovered a truth. "Lydia, she was upstairs before the rest of us, wasn't she? And wasn't it she who found that strange door? I dare say she had more reason than curiosity to be poking about up there." Mrs. Dalrymple nodded gravely, her eyes bright with the prospect of a scandal involving youth and impropriety. Miss Marple, passing them with a gentle smile, did not pause to comment. It was always instructive, she knew, to let suspicion settle naturally upon the most convenient target. Lydia was young, unguarded, and without family influence qualities that made her a perfect receptacle for village gossip. But Miss Marple also knew that real guilt seldom aligns so neatly with public opinion. More often, it clung to those who appeared least likely to be involved, masked beneath layers of respectable behavior. By mid-afternoon, Constable Briggs had paid a visit to Lydia's small cottage at the edge of the village. Neighbors saw her return from the market to find him waiting at her gate, and though no one could hear what was said, the sight of the girl standing there, pale and stiff-backed, was enough to confirm the whispers for some. Later, word spread that she had been asked to account for her whereabouts during the entire day of the tea, an inquiry that Mrs. Pembroke took as proof that the police were closing in. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in another development, one that had escaped general notice. Mr. Fenton had been seen speaking rather urgently with Colonel Hargrave in the lane behind the church, their conversation halting abruptly when young Tom Fletcher happened to pass by. Hargrave, a man whose bluster often concealed a keener mind than he cared to admit, had been among the first to suggest the dead man might have been some sort of criminal element. Yet the Colonel's face, Miss Marple recalled from the tea, had shown something sharper than mere disapproval when the body was discovered. The police's focus on Lydia left Mr. Fenton free to move about largely unexamined, though Miss Marple could not help noting that he kept to the periphery of things, never lingering long in public spaces. His wife, too, had retreated from view, sending messages through the maid when errands were necessary. This withdrawal was attributed to nerves, but Miss Marple knew that people under strain often revealed themselves not by what they did, but by what they avoided. That evening, over a modest supper, Miss Marple considered what she had observed so far. The curious door leading to the same room remained at the center of her thoughts. If it were merely an architectural quirk, it would have little bearing on the matter. But if it could be used to enter or leave unseen, or to give the impression of coming from one direction when in truth one had come from another, then it might serve as the perfect tool for misdirection. And misdirection, she knew, was the soul of both conjuring tricks and murder. The next day brought a small but telling incident. Mrs. Dalrymple, in the course of delivering her embroidery to the vicar's wife, let slip that she had once seen Mr. Fenton receive a letter with a foreign stamp, which he had promptly tucked into his coat without opening in public. This in itself might mean nothing, but Mrs. Dalrymple was quick to add that it had been shortly before the tea at Wetherby House. To her mind, such secrecy suggested clandestine dealings. To Miss Marple's, it suggested a thread worth keeping hold of, if only to see where it might lead. The tension in the village deepened when Briggs called on Miss Marple herself, ostensibly to clarify the sequence of events from the afternoon of the tea. She answered his questions with her usual precision, omitting nothing of what she had seen but adding nothing that might point him in the wrong direction. Briggs seemed eager to confirm his growing belief in Lydia's guilt, pressing her on whether the girl had appeared nervous or agitated before the body was found. Miss Marple merely remarked that young people often became flustered when surrounded by older company, particularly in unfamiliar surroundings. Briggs scribbled something in his notebook, thanked her, and left with the air of a man who felt himself on the cusp of resolution. But Miss Marple, standing at her window as the constable strode away, felt a different kind of certainty. The matter was far from resolved. The focus on Lydia was too neat, too satisfying to the village's appetite for a tidy scandal. Real crimes, she had learned, were rarely so obliging. Somewhere behind the locked doors and polite faces of Lower Bramble lay the true connection between the Fentons, the dead man, and that curious upstairs room. And until that connection revealed itself, she would watch and listen, and let others believe she was merely an elderly lady with a fondness for knitting. For the moment, the stage was set, the cast in place, and the curtain only just beginning to rise. There was more to be uncovered and in Miss Marple's experience. Once one thread began to unravel, the rest followed more quickly than anyone expected. Chapter 4. A hidden clue. Following morning brought with it a chill, bright air that made the frost on the hedgerows sparkle like powdered glass. Miss Marple, who always rose early, had just finished her tea when there came a brisk knock at her door. It was Lydia Marsh, her cheeks pink from the cold, clutching a brown paper parcel as if it might vanish from her hands. She seemed hesitant, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside at Miss Marple's invitation. "I don't know if it's important," she began, setting the parcel on the small table by the window, "but I thought you should see it before anyone else." The paper was untied to reveal a sketchbook, its pages smudged with graphite. On one leaf, near the middle, was a careful pencil drawing of the upstairs corridor at Weatherby House, the carved banister, the faded runner, the two doors at the far end. Lydia pointed to one of them, the left-hand door, her voice low. "That's the one I went through first. And this," she tapped the other, "is the one I opened later, when I found myself in the same room. But look here." She turned the page to another drawing, this one from memory, showing the interior of the room. On the windowsill in the sketch sat a small glass bottle with a cork stopper, half filled with what appeared to be dark liquid. Miss Marple examined the drawing with interest. "And this bottle," she asked mildly, "was it there both times?" Lydia hesitated. "Yes, I didn't think anything of it then. But later, I heard Mrs. Pembroke telling Mrs. Dalrymple that the doctor had said the man's lips were discolored, and that can happen with certain poisons. I thought, well, perhaps it matters." Miss Marple closed the book gently, her eyes thoughtful. The police, she suspected, had not been told about any such bottle. Whether from oversight or deliberate concealment, that detail had slipped past them. But Lydia's drawing preserved it, an unassuming sketch that might prove far more important than its maker realized. She thanked the girl, promising to keep the book safe for now, and sent her on her way with a gentle admonition to avoid talking too freely in the village. Later that morning, Miss Marple decided to call at Weatherby House, under the pretext of returning a handkerchief Mrs. Fenton had left at the tea. The maid, a sharp-faced young woman with the guarded air of one who has seen too much, admitted her reluctantly and went to fetch Mrs. Fenton, left alone in the front parlor. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to wander. A coat hung on the stand near the door, its pockets slightly bulging. A faint, unfamiliar scent lingered in the air, something metallic beneath the polish and lavender. When Mrs. Fenton entered, she was composed but pale, her smile fixed. "How kind of you, Miss Marple," she said, taking the folded handkerchief. "I've been quite unsettled since that dreadful afternoon." Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were clasped tightly together, and the left one bore a faint, fresh scratch along the knuckles. They exchanged polite conversation for a few minutes, but when Miss Marple casually mentioned the upstairs corridor and its curious pair of doors, Mrs. Fenton's expression faltered for the briefest instant. It was the sort of reaction, half-second, unguarded, that Miss Marple knew to be more revealing than any protestation of innocence. Upon leaving, she did not take the direct road home, but walked the long way through the churchyard. There she encountered Colonel Hargrave, who was staring rather intently at the Fentons' side gate. When she greeted him, he started slightly before returning her smile. "Just stretching the legs," he claimed, though his glance slid back toward the gate. Hargrave, she reflected, had the look of a man keeping watch, though whether as protector or opportunist remained to be seen. That evening, the constable stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly to assure her that matters were progressing. "We've nearly got it settled," Briggs said, with the air of a man eager to be commended. "The Marsh girl's story doesn't hold up too many inconsistencies, and there's no sign of any bottle in that room she claims to have seen twice. Must be her imagination." Miss Marple, knitting in her chair, murmured something about young people being fanciful, all the while considering how easily a small object might be removed in the confusion following a death. The night deepened. The fire burned low, and the village lay quiet under a thin frost. In her mind, Miss Marple fitted the day's small observations together: Lydia's sketch, the absent bottle, Mrs. Fenton's fleeting expression, and Colonel Hargrave's watch at the gate. None of them proved anything, not yet, but each was a stitch in a larger pattern one she was certain would, in time, reveal the shape of both the crime and its author. For now, she would wait. In her long experience, the truth had a way of showing itself when one knew exactly where to look, and she had an idea the next glimpse of it would come sooner than the murderer intended. Chapter 5. Confrontations and Secrets be the end of the week. The calm veneer of Lower Bramble had begun to fray. What had started as hushed curiosity now carried in edge questions asked too directly. Voices lowered in sudden silence when certain people approached. The constable's insistence that Lydia Marsh remained the most likely suspect had emboldened some, and unsettled others. Lydia herself had withdrawn almost entirely from view, rarely venturing beyond her garden gate except to fetch milk from the dairy, and then with her head bent low. It was clear to Miss Marple that the girl's isolation suited someone's purpose very well indeed. On Friday afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take a walk toward the northern lane, the one that wound past Wetherby House before curving into the wood. The air was sharp with the scent of damp leaves, and the sun filtered weakly through the trees. As she approached the house, she noticed Mrs. Fenton standing on the gravel drive, speaking in a quick, almost furtive manner to Colonel Hargrave. The colonel's stance was stiff, his chin drawn in, and though their words were too low to carry, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Mrs. Fenton broke away first, retreating into the house without looking back, while Hargrave remained, lighting a cigarette with a hand that trembled just enough for the match flame to waver. Miss Marple paused politely to greet him, remarking on the weather, and was met with a brusque nod. The colonel had always prided himself on forthrightness, yet now there was something in his manner that suggested calculation. As she moved on, she could not help thinking that those two were bound together by some knowledge neither wished to share with the constable. That evening, her quiet observations were interrupted by a visit from Mrs. Pembroke, who came under the pretense of delivering a basket of scones. The vicar's wife settled herself into the armchair opposite Miss Marple, smoothing her skirt with deliberate precision. "I dare say you've heard," she began, "that Hargrave has been seen about at all hours, loitering near the Fentons' property. And between ourselves, Jane, it isn't the first time I've wondered whether the colonel's finances are quite as sound as he lets on. There's talk, only talk, mind you, that he had dealings with a man in London who came to a bad end." Miss Marple, offering tea, merely murmured, "Indeed?" while noting that Mrs. Pembroke's appetite for scandal rarely distinguished between truth and embellishment. Still, she filed away the suggestion. In her experience, money or the lack of it was a motive that could weave itself into any number of crimes. The following morning brought another small revelation, this time from an unexpected quarter. Young Tom Fletcher, delivering eggs to Miss Marple's door, leaned in with a conspiratorial air. "I saw Mr. Fenton last night, ma'am, in the lane by the church. He was talking to someone, but when he spotted me, he stepped back into the shadows. Couldn't see who it was." Tom's eyes shone with the thrill of secrecy, and he dropped something looked like a bit of paper, but when I went back later, it was gone. It was a vague, boyish account, but it confirmed what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. Mr. Fenton was not the passive, grieving host he appeared to be. There were movements at odd hours, private meetings, a certain nervous watchfulness in his manner. The connection between the Fentons, Colonel Hargrave, and the dead man might be tangled, but it was no longer invisible. Miss Marple decided to take a small, calculated step. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the Fentons under the pretext of asking Mrs. Fenton for a recipe they had discussed at the tea. While in the parlor, she remarked almost idly on Lydia's artistic talent and mentioned that the girl had done a very good sketch of the upstairs corridor. Mrs. Fenton froze for the briefest moment, her eyes flicking to her husband before she replied, "Oh, how interesting." It was all the confirmation Miss Marple needed to know that the existence of that sketch was, to the Fentons, a matter of concern. As she left, she passed the maid in the hall, who was carrying a tray upstairs. The girl glanced over her shoulder before whispering, "Best keep out of it, miss. Folks who ask questions in this house don't fare well." Her words were gone as quickly as they came. replaced by the brisk clatter of her shoes on the steps. But they lingered with Miss Marple long after she had reached the lane. That night, sitting by her fire, Miss Marple laid out the pieces in her mind. There was the bottle Lydia had drawn, the odd architecture of the upstairs corridor, the undercurrent between Mrs. Fenton and Colonel Hargrave, and Mr. Fenton's shadowy meetings. Any one of these might be explained away, but taken together, they formed the outline of a truth that was pressing to the surface. Someone had arranged matters very carefully, and someone else, she thought, was beginning to lose their grip on the arrangement. In her experience, it was at this point when the strain of secrecy began to show that people made mistakes, and it was precisely then that one had to watch most closely, all the while seeming to watch not at all. Chapter 6. Another twist. First true frost of the season came the next morning, silvering the rooftops and making the air so clear that every sound seemed sharpened. The village awoke to the sight of Constable Briggs striding purposefully along the high street, his expression more severe than usual. Word spread quickly there had been another incident at Wetherby House. No one knew the details, but Mrs. Pembroke claimed to have it on good authority from her husband's verger that a second death had occurred. By midday, the rumor had settled into something more specific. Colonel Hargrave had been taken ill during a morning visit to the Fentons and was now under the care of the doctor. Miss Marple heard the news from Lydia, who arrived breathless at her gate, cheeks flushed with cold and alarm. "They say it was sudden," the girl said. "He collapsed in the parlor. Mrs. Fenton called for help at once. The doctor says it might be his heart, but—" She trailed off, eyes wide with unspoken suspicion. Miss Marple invited her in, seating her by the fire with a cup of tea. "Sudden illnesses," she observed gently, "do have a way of appearing at the most inconvenient times, and sometimes they are exactly what they seem, but sometimes they are not." That afternoon, Miss Marple took the lane past Wetherby House. The place had an odd stillness about it, as though it were holding its breath. Through a narrow gap in the drawn curtains, she glimpsed Mrs. Fenton moving briskly about the parlor, straightening things that did not appear to need straightening. A moment later, Mr. Fenton emerged from the front door, his hat pulled low, and set off toward the post office with a stride that suggested both haste and purpose. Miss Marple noted the direction, the time of day, and the fact that he carried no letters in his hand when he left at the post office. She lingered in polite conversation with Mrs. Pierce, the postmistress, who was sorting through a bundle of envelopes. When Mr. Fenton arrived, he asked for a package in a tone that suggested it had been prearranged. Mrs. Pierce produced a small, flat parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He paid without comment and left swiftly, his eyes sliding away from Miss Marple's with a flicker of something that might have been wariness. On her way home, Miss Marple crossed paths with Dr. Reynolds, who confirmed that Colonel Hargrave was resting, but in no condition to be questioned about anything. The doctor, a man not given to flights of imagination, nevertheless looked troubled. It was the suddenness of it. Miss Marple. 1 minute the colonel was his usual self, blustering, argumentative, and the next he was on the floor. His pulse was irregular, but not weak. "I can't quite put my finger on it." That night, Miss Marple turned the matter over in her mind. If Hargrave had been silenced, whether by illness or design, it suggested that whatever he knew, or suspected, was dangerous to someone. And if that someone had already removed one man from the scene, it was entirely possible they would not hesitate to do so again. The next morning brought another piece to the puzzle. Young Tom Fletcher appeared at her door, grinning with the air of someone bearing a valuable secret. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I saw the colonel at the house 2 days ago. He had a little packet, same size as the one Mr. Fenton took from the post today." "I reckon they're the same." Miss Marple asked no questions, merely thanked the boy and sent him on his way. but her mind was already stitching the details together to parcels similar in size, two men with an interest in their contents. And now one of them was lying ill, unable to speak. That afternoon, she took a slow walk to the churchyard, ostensibly to tend to a few neglected graves. As she worked, she noticed Lydia standing near the yew trees, sketchbook in hand. The girl approached hesitantly and showed her a new drawing, the upstairs bedroom at Weatherby House, this time with the curtains half drawn and a faint outline of something bulky beneath the bedspread. "I went back," Lydia confessed. "I shouldn't have, I know, but I wanted to see if the room felt as strange as before. And it did. I only looked for a moment, but it seemed as though someone had hidden something there." Miss Marple studied the sketch, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes," she said, "things are hidden in plain sight, my dear, and sometimes they are hidden so that they may be found by the right person at the right time." As the light faded and the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple walked home with the sure sense that the game was shifting. The bottle in Lydia's first drawing, the curious twin doors, the quiet exchanges between the Fentons and Hargrave, the mysterious parcels, each was part of the same design. The second incident was not a separate mystery, but an echo of the first, meant to keep certain truths from coming into the open. And yet, she felt the balance tilting. Those who had been so careful to keep their secrets were now being driven to act too quickly, too boldly. That, in her experience, was when mistakes crept in, mistakes that could be quietly gathered up like loose stitches until the whole pattern could be laid bare. Chapter 7. The net tightens. By Sunday morning, the frost had given way to a pale mist that clung low over the fields, blurring the outlines of the hedgerows and softening the steeple of St. Agnes against the sky. The village seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath in expectation. Miss Marple, however, went about her morning as she always did, feeding the birds at her kitchen window and arranging a small spray of chrysanthemums for the hall table. Yet her mind was far from idle. The events of the past week had begun to form a pattern not yet complete, but distinct enough for her to sense its direction. After church, she lingered outside the porch, exchanging mild pleasantries until she caught sight of Mr. Fenton making his way toward the gate. His expression was carefully composed, but there was a tautness to his movements, a deliberate control that spoke of someone carrying more than the usual burden of Sunday thoughts. Miss Marple stepped into his path with a warm smile. "Such a fine sermon this morning, was it not? It put me in mind of the parable of the talents." The remark was harmless enough, yet she watched with interest as a flicker, half irritation, half distraction passed across his face before he replied. She walked with him a short way down the lane, guiding the conversation as lightly as a thread through a needle's eye. She spoke of Lydia's sketches, of the charm of old houses, of the way certain architectural features could lend themselves to the most curious effects. When she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had once visited a house with a door that allowed one to enter unseen from an entirely different part of the building, Mr. Fenton's pace slowed for a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly, offering a polite, dismissive chuckle. But Miss Marple had already marked the pause. It was the sort of moment, she knew, when the mind betrayed itself before words could intervene. That afternoon, Lydia came to her cottage again, her face pale with fresh worry. She had been told, in no uncertain terms by the constable, to stay away from Weatherby House and stop stirring matters up. The warning had upset her, but it was not what had brought her. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I think someone's been in my cottage. Nothing's gone, but my sketchbook, the one I gave you, it was in the drawer where I keep my scarves. I never told anyone I put it there." Miss Marple assured her it was safe in her keeping, but the implication was clear. Someone wanted that sketch, and they were willing to take risks to find it. Later, as the mist thickened into an early dusk, Miss Marple walked to the post office on a trivial errand for needles. She found Mrs. Pierce eager to talk. "Funny thing, Miss Marple," the postmistress said in a low voice. "That parcel Mr. Fenton collected the other day, it came from an address in Dover. And wouldn't you know, the Colonel had one from the same place a fortnight ago. Odd coincidence, don't you think?" Miss Marple agreed that coincidences could be very odd indeed. On her way home, she passed Colonel Hargrave's cottage. The curtains were drawn, but a faint light burned in an upstairs window. The doctor's small trap sat outside, its wheels crusted with frost. Miss Marple stood for a moment at the gate listening. Somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked, followed by a muffled cough. It seemed the Colonel's rest was not entirely undisturbed that evening. She laid the facts out in her mind, as a dressmaker might arrange pieces of cloth before cutting. There was the peculiar door, the missing bottle, the hidden object in the upstairs bedroom, the exchange of parcels, and now the intrusion at Lydia's home. And running through it all, a thread of urgency actions taken not with the patience of a careful plan, but with the haste of someone who feared the window for concealment was closing. She knew the time was coming to act, but not yet to accuse. A premature word could drive the quarry deeper into the thicket, where the trail would be harder to follow. Instead, she would do as she always had: wait, watch, and set the smallest of traps. The next move, she suspected, would not come from her, but from the person who most feared what she might know. And when that move came, she would be ready. Chapter 8. The quiet Snareth next day dawned with a pale sun breaking through the mist, casting long shadows over the frost-crisped lawns. Miss Marple sat by her front window with her knitting. Though her needles moved more slowly than usual, her mind was occupied with the delicate business of arranging circumstances, so that those who had something to hide would feel compelled to act. She had no intention of confronting anyone directly, not yet. Instead, she would simply create an opportunity, a small shift in the pattern, and watch what followed. After luncheon, she walked to the grocer's and, quite by chance or so it seemed to those who overheard, she mentioned to Mrs. Pembroke, in a voice just loud enough to carry, that Lydia's sketchbook was quite safe, and in a place where it would do the most good should the police need it. She added that it contained a very clear drawing of that upstairs room at Wetherby House, down to the smallest detail. Mrs. Pembroke, whose love of passing along morsels of information was exceeded only by her speed in doing so, assured Miss Marple she would pray for the girl's safety, and went off toward the church, her eyes bright with the prospect of repeating the news. By the time Miss Marple reached home, she had no doubt the remark would be halfway across the village. Those who were merely curious would think nothing of it, but to the person who had already broken into Lydia's cottage, it would be a warning and, more importantly, a lure. She placed the sketchbook in plain view on the small table beneath her parlor window, then settled into her armchair with the appearance of a woman, prepared for an afternoon of quiet knitting. It was near dusk when she noticed movement outside, a shadow slipping along the hedge. The figure paused by her gate, then moved on, only to return some minutes later from the opposite direction. There was a faint scrape at the latch before the figure melted back into the deepening gloom. Miss Marple did not stir. She had seen enough to know two things. Her bait had been noticed, and whoever had come was cautious enough to make certain she was not alone before trying again. The following morning brought a fresh ripple of gossip. Mrs. Dalrymple declared that she had seen Mr. Fenton walking toward Miss Marple's lane the previous evening, though she could not imagine what business he had there. Others claimed it was the Colonel's manservant, sent on some errand. Miss Marple kept her counsel. The purpose of a snare, after all, was not to close too soon. In the afternoon, she paid a call on Dr. Reynolds under the pretense of asking after the Colonel. The doctor reported that Hargrave was improving but still weak and irritable, he added with a rueful smile. Keeps asking for a certain packet he insists was left in his coat pocket. When he came to the Fentons, says it's important. Miss Marple only nodded, tucking away the information. The packet could well be the same size and shape as the parcels mentioned by Mrs. Pierce. On her way back, she met Lydia, who was returning from the dairy. The girl seemed anxious, casting glances over her shoulder. "I saw Mrs. Fenton this morning," she said. "She stopped me in the lane and asked if I'd be willing to meet her privately at dusk, near the old well behind the church. She said she wanted to clear up a misunderstanding." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained mild. "And you intend to go, my dear?" Lydia hesitated. "I'm not sure. It doesn't feel right. But I thought, perhaps you might come, too. Not where she could see you, just close enough." Miss Marple agreed without hesitation. When dusk fell, she took up a place among the yew trees at the edge of the churchyard. The cold air was sharp in her lungs, and the first stars were pricking through the fading blue. From her vantage, she saw Lydia approach the well, her figure slight against the stone. A few minutes later, Mrs. Fenton emerged from the shadows, her face pale and tense. Their conversation was too low to carry, but Miss Marple saw the moment when Mrs. Fenton's hand closed briefly on Lydia's arm, the gesture firm rather than friendly. After a short exchange, Mrs. Fenton turned abruptly and left, her steps quickening as she disappeared into the lane. Lydia came to Miss Marple at once, her breath misting in the air. "She wanted me to say if anyone asked that I'd been mistaken about seeing her with the dead man. Before the tea, she said it was for my own good." The girl's voice shook slightly. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if afraid someone would hear. As they walked home together, Miss Marple reflected that the net was drawing tighter, though not by her hand alone. The fear that drove Mrs. Fenton to such a meeting was the same fear that had prompted the parcel exchanges, the furtive conversations, and perhaps even Colonel Hargrave's sudden collapse. It was only a matter of time before the connections revealed themselves. That night, she sat in her parlor, the fire casting flickering light across the sketchbook still lying in plain sight. She did not move it. The bait remained, and she knew the hand that reached for it next would be the same hand that had set the rest of this dangerous business in motion. Miss Marple did not sleep much that night. The meeting at the old well replayed in her mind in small fragments. Mrs. Fenton's urgent grip on Lydia's arm, the darting glances over her shoulder, the final hurried retreat into the darkness. Such behavior, she reflected, was not that of a woman entirely confident in her own safety. Fear was there, yes, but fear could come from two directions: from being wrongly accused, or from the knowledge that guilt might soon be uncovered. The trick was to determine which kind of fear Mrs. Fenton carried. The cottage lay still, the coals in the hearth settling to a dull red glow. From somewhere beyond the hedge came the faint crunch of footsteps on frost-hardened earth. Miss Marple did not stir from her chair, but her eyes moved toward the window, listening for the rhythm of those steps. They were cautious, halting at intervals, as if the walker were pausing to listen and turn. Then they faded toward the lane. It might have been nothing, a villager taking a shortcut, but she had long since ceased to believe in coincidences that occurred at just the wrong time. By morning, the frost had deepened, silvering the lane outside her gate. Lydia arrived just after breakfast, her expression troubled. "I hardly slept," she confessed. "It's as if someone's watching my cottage. I keep thinking I hear the latch of the gate." Miss Marple poured her tea, adding an extra lump of sugar in the absent-minded way she did when her thoughts were elsewhere. "If someone is watching, my dear, then they will watch for a reason. The thing is to find out what they fear you might do." She sent Lydia home the long way, past the high street and the post office, so that her movements would be seen and remarked upon. Visibility, she knew, could be as useful a shield as secrecy. As for herself, she took the narrow path behind the churchyard, where the yews met overhead and muffled sound. It was there she paused, just beyond the lichen-covered wall, and saw Mrs. Fenton speaking in a low, urgent tone to a man half hidden in the shadow of the porch. Even at that distance, she recognized the set of his shoulders. Mr. Fenton listened without expression, then handed her something small enough to vanish into her palm before they parted in opposite directions. Miss Marple did not approach them. There was no need to chase a rabbit when one could follow the trail it left behind. Instead, she continued on her way, stopping at the post office where Mrs. Pierce, in her usual conspiratorial manner, confided that there's been another letter from Dover, this time from Mrs. Fenton herself. The information settled into Miss Marple's mind like the last piece of a half-formed pattern. That afternoon, she placed the genuine sketchbook in a drawer by her writing desk, locking it away. The copy remained in plain sight in the parlor. She had decided it would stay there until someone, convinced of their necessity, made the mistake of taking it. It was not enough to know who had reached for it. She wanted to see how far they would go to retrieve what they thought was damning. Evening came early, the light fading to a muted gray. She lit her lamp, the glow spilling softly onto the table where the sketchbook lay, and settled in her chair with her knitting. Outside, the lane grew quiet. A cart passed once, the sound of its wheels muffled on the frost. Then silence. In the stillness, she could almost sense the moment when someone, standing beyond the hedge, decided the time was right. When at last the shadow moved toward her gate, she kept her eyes fixed on her work, her fingers steady. The latch clicked, the path creaked under a careful step, and a pause followed by the faintest scrape of metal at the window frame told her that the trap she had set so softly, so patiently was beginning to close. Chapter 9. The hand that reached the following evening was darker than most for that time of year. The sky banked with heavy clouds that blotted out the moon. A damp wind carried the scent of rain, though none had yet fallen, and the lanes of lower bramble lay in deep shadow. Miss Marple had drawn her curtains as usual, but left one slightly ajar, just enough for her to watch the front path without being seen. The sketchbook remained on the small table by the parlor window, its placement deliberate, the lamplight falling so that its outline could be glimpsed from outside. She spent the early part of the evening in her armchair with her knitting, pausing now and then to listen. The village was quiet, save for the occasional clop of a horse on the high street or the faint bark of a dog in the distance. It was close to 9 when she caught it, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for the rustle of leaves. A shadow detached itself from the hedge and moved toward her gate. The latch clicked, and the figure approached the parlor window, pausing just beyond the spill of lampligt. Miss Marple kept her eyes lowered, her needles still in motion, though her mind was sharply alert. The figure hesitated, then tried the latch of the front door, finding it locked. A moment later came the faint creak of the side gate, the soft press of footsteps along the garden path. She heard the parlor window's catch tested, then a pause, followed by the faint scrape of something metallic, perhaps a small blade against the frame. The window lifted an inch. There was a whisper of fabric as the intruder reached in, fingers brushing the table. They closed around the sketchbook, hesitating only for a moment before withdrawing. Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest inward smile. She had seen enough in that fleeting reach, broad, capable hands with a faint scar across the second knuckle. It was a detail she had already noted once before, though at the time it had seemed of little consequence. The figure retreated the way they had come, disappearing into the dark lane, without haste, but with the measured pace of someone who believed themselves unseen. Miss Marple rose, securing the window and drawing the curtains fully closed. The bait had been taken, and with it, she suspected, the last pretense of innocence. The next morning brought confirmation of sorts. Mrs. Dalrymple, always eager to share a morsel, mentioned seeing Mr. Fenton returning to Weatherby House late the previous night, his coat collar turned up and his stride unusually quick. She assumed he had been visiting a friend in the next village, though she could not name which. Miss Marple merely nodded, storing the information alongside the memory of those scarred fingers. Later that day, she called at the post office for a packet of sewing needles and found Mrs. Pierce sorting a fresh delivery. In the bundle was an envelope addressed to Colonel Hargrave, postmarked Dover, the same origin as the parcels. Mrs. Pierce confided that a similar letter had arrived for Mr. Fenton only 2 days earlier. The coincidence was narrowing into something sharper, and Miss Marple could almost feel the strands of the web drawing taut in the afternoon. She visited Lydia to return the sketchbook, or rather, a sketchbook. The one she handed over was a harmless duplicate, filled with simple drawings that bore no hint of the upstairs room or the mysterious bottle. Lydia's eyes widened when she realized. "You still have the real one?" she whispered. Miss Marple's nod was accompanied by a quiet reminder to keep her composure in public. The less the village suspected of their arrangement, the better. Toward evening, she took a slow walk past Weatherby House. A light glowed in the upstairs bedroom, the very one with the twin doors, and through the sheer curtains she glimpsed Mrs. Fenton moving about, her manner brisk, purposeful. It was not the restless pacing of a woman unsettled by grief. It was the measured organization of someone arranging things to be found or not found by others. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage again, she had decided on her next step. The moment to set her own terms was approaching, but the picture was not yet complete. There remained one unanswered question. What was in those parcels from Dover? And how did they bind together Mr. Fenton, Colonel Hargrave, and the man who had died in that upstairs room? The answer, she knew, would not come from direct inquiry. It would come when one of them, under the strain of holding too many secrets, made the smallest slip. That night, she left her curtains drawn tight, the lamps low, and the house in a hush. The sketchbook, this time the genuine one, was locked away in a place where no hand but her own could reach it. The hand she had seen through the window had told her what she needed to know. Now it was only a matter of time before that same hand, or its owner's voice, betrayed the rest. Miss Marple did not rise when the shadow left her garden that night. She waited until the quiet had settled back over the lane, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then she crossed to the window, securing the latch and drawing the curtain tight. The sketchbook's absence left a small, bare square on the table exactly as she had intended. She poured herself a modest cup of tea before retiring, her thoughts moving in slow, deliberate circles. The scarred knuckle was not something one could acquire lightly. Such marks spoke of a past incident of fight, perhaps, or work that was not entirely lawful, and she could recall, with the clarity of a needle finding its stitch, when she had last seen that same scar. It had been at the tea gathering, when Mr. Fenton reached to adjust the teacups on the tray, his fingers brushing the edge of a saucer. She had noticed it then as a small curiosity, nothing more until now. The next morning broke pale and thin, with a brittle frost that cracked underfoot. As Miss Marple stepped out to sweep her front path, she noted a faint indentation in the gravel near the side gate, not the imprint of a boot heel, but the drag of a toe, as if the walker had been careful to step lightly and avoid leaving a clear mark. It was an effort wasted. Carelessness and caution often left the same kind of trail, and she knew the difference between the footstep of an accidental passerby and one with a purpose. She spent the morning calling on neighbors with small errands, returning a book to Mrs. Pembroke, collecting sewing cotton from Mrs. Dalrymple, making certain that her movements were seen and remarked upon. Visibility, she knew, was the surest way to unsettle someone who preferred their quarry unaware. The guilty, when they thought they had stolen something of value, often became restless if their victim appeared entirely unbothered. By midday, the effect was already beginning to show. Passing along the lane by Wetherby House, she saw Mr. Fenton in the garden, ostensibly trimming a hedge, yet when he caught sight of her, his shears slowed, and his eyes flicked just once toward the parlor window of her cottage down the way. She greeted him with her usual warmth, speaking of the weather, and his reply was polite but oddly clipped, as though he feared to linger in conversation. That afternoon brought a visit from Lydia. Pale and tight-lipped. "Someone's been asking about me," she said. "Mrs. Dalrymple told me Mr. Fenton inquired where I'd been the past 2 evenings." She thought it odd, since we hardly speak. Miss Marple listened, her expression calm. "When people begin to count your movements, my dear, it is usually because they are uncertain of their own." After Lydia left, Miss Marple sat by the fire and turned the matter over again. She was no longer in doubt as to who had taken the sketchbook. What remained was understanding why. The drawing of the upstairs room was damning enough in its way, but the urgency the risk taken to obtain it suggested it connected directly to the reason. The man had died there, and if Mr. Fenton now possessed it, he would either hide it away or destroy it. In either case, the knowledge of its contents still lay with her. Evening crept in, bringing a fine mist that softened the lamplight along the high street. From her front window, she could see the faint glow of lamps in Wetherby House, one upstairs, one in the front parlor. The house looked peaceful, but Miss Marple knew better. Within those walls, someone was calculating their next step and making ready for the moment when they believed the last threat to their safety could be removed. She folded her knitting and set it aside, the fire's warmth at her back. The time for patient watching was drawing to a close. Now it would be a matter of placing the right people in the same room, at the right time, and letting their own words and their silences do the work. The scarred hand had reached, but it had also overreached. Soon, she thought, the rest of the truth would follow. Chapter 10. The slip in the masked frost returned the next morning. Delicate white lace across the lawns and hedgerows. Miss Marple was at her gate scattering crumbs for the sparrows. When Mr. Fenton came striding down the lane, his hat pulled low, he tipped it in greeting, but did not slow his pace. She called after him in her mild, unhurried voice. "Mr. Fenton, might I trouble you for a word? It's about something Colonel Hargrave said to me yesterday that stopped him." He turned, masking his expression with polite curiosity, but the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth did not escape her. "Of course, Miss Marple. What was that?" She let a pause hang in the cold air before replying, as though weighing whether to repeat something of uncertain propriety. "He was asking quite insistently after a certain packet he says was in his coat the day of his unfortunate collapse. I told him I knew nothing of it, but it did make me wonder. He seemed convinced it had passed into other hands." Fenton's gaze flickered, just for a moment, toward the village in the direction of the post office. It was only a heartbeat, but enough. He recovered quickly with a shrug. "The Colonel's been unwell. One imagines he's confused." His voice was smooth, but it held that careful flatness of a man treading on dangerous ground. They parted soon after, but Miss Marple had no doubt she had struck the right chord. She had learned long ago that the guilty often feared the wrong detail revealing, by what they guarded most closely, precisely where the truth lay. That afternoon she visited the Colonel himself, carrying a small posy of winter jasmine. He was propped up in bed, irritable but glad of the company. In the course of their conversation, she steered things gently back to the packet. Hargrave leaned forward, his voice dropping. "It's not the money, Miss Marple, though there was some in it. It's the papers, names, dates. Proof, you understand, that our friend Fenton has not been quite the respectable gentleman he claims." His eyes sharpened. "If that fellow thinks I won't speak, he's mistaken." Miss Marple's smile was small and non-committal. One must take care, Colonel. Illness can make for unfortunate accidents. The words had their intended effect. His bluster faltered into a wary silence. She had no need to say more. The seed was planted. By evening, word had reached her, via Mrs. Dalrymple, that Mrs. Fenton had been seen walking swiftly toward the churchyard after dark, carrying what looked like a flat envelope. Mrs. Dalrymple, of course, imagined a romantic intrigue. Miss Marple imagined something else entirely, a disposal, perhaps, or a delivery meant to prevent the Colonel's papers from ever resurfacing. She spent the rest of the evening in her parlor, the fire warm at her back, considering the chain of events. The dead man in the upstairs bedroom, the bottle Lydia had drawn, the Dover parcels, the Colonel's packet, the scarred hand reaching for the sketchbook, all threads of the same weave. The motive, she felt, was not some sudden quarrel but an older, colder business, one that had finally spilled into their quiet village. There was only one thing left to do, and she would do it in her own quiet fashion. Tomorrow, she would invite both the Fentons and the Colonel to tea. The setting would be harmless enough, the conversation seemingly innocent, but she would guide it oh so gently toward that one small, dangerous detail that each of them believed only they knew. And when one of them faltered, even for a heartbeat, she would be ready. Miss Marple folded her hands, the firelight catching the glint of her knitting needles where they lay beside her chair. Outside, the frost was thickening again, sealing the village under its white hush. Somewhere not far away, the person who had set all this in motion was certain they were still in control. Tomorrow, they would find otherwise.